This great and humane composer never shirked what seemed to him to be the truth, in thought or feeling. His profound human qualities were matched by a first-rate intellectual mastery of his ideas, and this means that there is in his music an altogether unusually wide and deep range. In his work we can find almost everything, from humour to tragedy, sometimes a blend of both. He can exult, or he can search darkly, and he knows simple human delight as well as complex inner conflict. The expression, where necessary, is enormously intense, yet it's always quite free from inflation, exaggeration, self-dramatization. Always true, pure, objective. Music can impersonate human feelings. It can deceive the listener, and even its composer. But only genius of a very high order is able to make music that is human, naturally, maturely, actually human, so that the intensest of feelings is expressed as a matter of what? Fact, not fiction. It's in this that Nielsen's greatness lies. He's influenced me deeply as a composer, but what's more important, he's taught me about life and living. These brief commentaries are meant to help the listener who may find some difficulty in following a written analysis. If you can hear a few sounds and a few words, it may well mean much more to you than the printed page, especially if technicalities are kept to a minimum. So here goes. Let's have a look at the first symphony. First of all, just listen to these chords. They're all C major. Here's another lot of chords. Those are all G minor chords. C major, G minor. All those chords, the bright C major ones and the darker G minor ones, are from all over Nielsen's first symphony. When musicians first encountered this symphony in 1892, it was described as being in G minor. They were therefore somewhat surprised by the bright chord of C major it starts with. You can hear how it instantly darkens into G minor. This was slightly surprising, but nothing compared with the fact that the whole symphony ends in a blaze of C major. Here already, when Nielsen was 27, we find the essence of his individual way of treating keys. Although the symphony is said to be in G minor, it's really a tug of war between two keys, G minor and C. C major wins in the end, but the contest goes right through the symphony and can be traced at every turn, not always obviously, and sometimes very subtly indeed. As a consistently organic way of thinking, this was new, and in various ways it's the basis of all the symphonies. And it isn't always a contest between two keys. In the second symphony, for instance, the key in which it ends is the final outcome of a different process, in the last analysis essentially humorous. The fifth symphony evolves its final tonality. Each symphony has its own individual process, but the essence of them all is to be found in an evolutionary energy. Nielsen himself said, "Unless my music has a current, it's nothing." The tonalities or keys form the current in which the themes and rhythms swim towards a goal. It's a dynamic and original idea. Nielsen never talked about it. Instead, characteristically, he carried it out. In the first symphony, as you'd expect, the process is less intricate than in the later works, but it's still completely realized and very clear. In the first movement, G minor's the boss. C major's something of an intruder. It puts its face in the picture at the very start, but it's at once forced to withdraw. It has another shot when Nielsen repeats the exposition. There are various places in this movement where C major is subtly hinted at. But we'll just take note of a bit of an argument that goes on in the coda. Nobody seems to agree about what the key is, and just as C major seems about to snatch order out of the chaos, G minor bulldozes it out of the way and retakes control. Here's the little whiff of C major. Now the passage up to the victory of G minor over C. The key of G minor, having got control of the first movement, the second falls naturally into G major. The delightful third movement, flowing like a clear stream, is in E flat, which is a sort of no man's land between G minor and C. Here's the sound of E flat. There's a contrasting, slower theme. Can you hear those C major chords reminding you of their existence? Near the end, the C major chords get involved in a poetic disagreement with A flat minor, a close relative of E flat. A flat minor on strings, C major on woodwind. Then the movement takes itself off in E flat before there can be any further trouble. But C major isn't beaten yet. It starts the finale with more aggressiveness than it did the first movement. Notice how it persistently breaks through the G minor, which isn't nearly so sure of itself now. The exposition is repeated, as in the first movement, and the central development culminates in a powerful passage in B major and D flat. Here's the B major. And here's the D flat. Now B and D flat are each a semitone on either side of C, and they cancel each other out, so that soon afterwards we get a big crescendo on a chord of C major. As you heard, it gets into a fight with G minor again, and we're in the recapitulation. In the coda, C major makes its final breakthrough, and the symphony ends vividly in that key. hope these few examples have shown you that all these things are audible, that they mean something in terms of music. That doesn't mean to say that when you listen to these symphonies, you have to analyze everything in your head all the time. The effect is what counts. My favorite analogy is a smile. If somebody smiles at you, you know instantly what sort of smile it is, whether it's kindly, humorous, ironic, downright nasty. There are millions of different kinds of smiles. But although we know at once what kind of a smile it is, we haven't a hope of analysing all the fantastic mental, neural and muscular complexities that make it the sort of smile it is. We can explain a little more in music, and I can try and show you why this music is so organic. But it doesn't alter the fact that all these things are directed at your ears in exactly the same way that a smile is aimed at your eyes. The composer doesn't expect you to explain it all to yourself as you listen, any more than I expect you to act like some sort of supercomputer if I smile at you. We don't have to be biologists in order to understand our friends, or botanists to love the beauty of a rose. But a rose is more, not less wonderful, the more we know about it. And the advantage of a gramophone record is that you can go on repeating a musical experience until it sinks in. You'll find that this music will triumphantly stand that test. Nielsen wasn't a programmatic composer in either the romantic or pictorial sense. If he gave a work a title, it was an indication of character or kind, as when Beethoven used the words eroica or pastoral. The music stands on its own feet, but in such cases as these, both Beethoven and Nielsen seem to have felt no harm in letting the listener in on the impulse behind the music. Beethoven said of the Pastoral Symphony that it was more an expression of feeling than painting, and Nielsen said, "The program or title must in itself contain a germ of feeling or movement, but never a crude description of concrete events." Whether Nielsen's symphonies have titles or not, we can still find a steady growth of purely musical mastery in them. It's on this we must concentrate. But the names of his second, third and fourth symphonies do give us an interesting clue to the nature of his human development. In number 1, we find a young composer, very conscious of his own powers, determined to show what he can do, starting at once with a bold stroke, which he then turns into a structural principle for the whole work. But Nielsen was naturally curious, generous, fascinated by life and people, looking outward and around. So the Four Temperaments shows his interest in types of human character. The Third Symphony, a few years later, shows an exhilarated response to life at large, and an outward growth in mental scope, an expansion in the best sense, hence the title espansiva, which has nothing to do with physical size or length, or with romantic inflation. The next stage is the perception of life as an evolutionary process that the greatest disasters cannot stop. Whatever happens, something will survive, somehow. So we have the Fourth Symphony, the Inextinguishable, or as some say, the Unquenchable. I don't dare attempt it in Danish. In English it sounds more pretentious than he intended, but the toughness and power of the music is enough. Without the title, we'd have been aware of something very formidable, as indeed we are in the Fifth Symphony, which has no name. But now we must turn to number 2. Nielsen himself described in a rather amusing program note how he saw some crude pictures in a pub in Zealand, thus getting the idea for a symphony. The Four Temperaments are the choleric, the phlegmatic, the melancholic, and the sanguine. Like all the other symphonies, this one has an all-embracing key system. The choleric temperament breaks out in a fierce B minor. In a real human personality with a dominant characteristic, streaks of all the other kinds of temperament are present too. And Nielsen's too much of a realist to have his choleric man roaring with rage all the time. He's capable of tenderness and has something noble in him. That was G major. It's the first big change of key in the movement. And in this symphony, each movement has a way of anticipating in some noticeable way the key of the next. So the phlegmatic temperament strolls lazily out in G major. There's one surprise in the piece, a sudden loud noise, of which our imperturbable friend takes no notice whatsoever. But it does cause a gorgeous modulation to the key of E flat. E flat minor is the key of the melancholic temperament. There's another connection between these two middle movements. Notice how in each case the melody is introduced by a descending motion, and how the melancholy one is obviously derived from the phlegmatic one. Here they are, one after the other. It's as if too much complacency produces melancholy. But Nielsen's melancholic character is one of his deepest and grandest studies in human nature. I think Brahms would have been lost in admiration for this superb movement. He'd already praised the First Symphony, but didn't live to see any more of Nielsen's work. There's no self-pity in it, simply a wide and deep search for a way out, sometimes brooding, sometimes powerfully heroic. The last great climax opens magnificently in D minor. As the E flat major in the phlegmatic temperament foreshadowed the E flat minor of the choleric, so the D minor in the melancholic hints at the D major of the sanguine. But why D major? The other three movements have gone down by major thirds. B, the first movement, to G, the second movement, to E flat, third movement. The obvious thing would be to go down another major third for the finale. That would be B major, so that the symphony could end neatly in the tonic major. And Nielsen number 2 would then be similar to Brahms number 1, but going in the opposite direction. The Brahms movements go upwards by thirds, C, E, A flat, and C. When Nielsen avoids the obvious, we can suspect a subtlety, and it's this. If he'd put the last movement in B major, it wouldn't have been B major at all. It would have sounded like C flat major after the E flat minor of the previous slow movement. Far from being a brilliant change, it would have seemed too dark and serious. But D major is after all a close relative of the B minor of the first movement. So he ends the E flat minor slow movement on a half close with a chord of B flat major, from which he's able to leap brilliantly into D major with complete sanguinity. constructive development would be all wrong for the sanguine temperament. It's basically irresponsible and wild. This piece is simple and exhilarating. But subtleties aren't out of the question, because Nielsen is a subtle observer. Eventually there comes a moment of puzzlement, a dark, in some ways rather Haydn-like adagio in C minor. In fact, a recapitulation of the second subject transformed. The reaction of the sanguine character to this is to forget it, to such an extent that he forgets too that D major is the key of the movement, and he tears away into its dominant A major. The symphony ends with a mock pompous march that I find gloriously full of comic elation. When you hear it next, listen to its bass. It's quite magnificent. The third symphony was finished in 1911, and as I've already suggested, it expresses a mental rather than a physical expansion. It's not much longer than its predecessors, but it's very much more complex and far-reaching. With each Nielsen symphony, the task of briefly describing its structure becomes more difficult, simply because as his outlook and mastery develop, so the subtleties multiply. Yet number 3 is, if anything, more direct in its appeal than the two earlier symphonies. It represents that rare thing, a state of perfect health, mental and physical. In times like ours, there's a tendency to regard as interesting only such artists as appear to be in need of medical or psychiatric attention. If Nielsen has to wait for better times for full appreciation, he may have to wait a long time, perhaps forever. But if it does come, his triumph will be all the greater. Mahler said, "My time will come." Nielsen's music says, "Humanity's time will come." I hope he's right, because it's necessary he should be. In its broadest outline, the structure of the espansiva is an immense progression from the key of D minor to the major key a fifth higher, A major. The first movement starts with an accelerating tattoo of A's, which are seen to have been the dominant of D minor when the woodwind fly off with a D minor theme. After all sorts of adventures, this tremendous movement eventually succeeds in driving home A minor, turning at the last minute to A major. At the end was only what's known as a tierce de Picardy, used for centuries as a cadential emphasis, and the slow movement follows in C major, closely related to A minor. This unusual movement is based on a series of sustained notes, or pedals, which behave like a tonal plateau. We move systematically from one to the next. First, C. The horns hold it, while the strings give out a long flowing line. Soon the held note goes up a third, to E, and the timpani and double basses sustain it, while the woodwind float over it with beautiful counterpoint. The strings interrupt with passionate and dignified phrases, and when they've finished, the pedal note emerges another third higher, on G, basses and timps again, and the woodwind continue their melismata. Again the strings interrupt, this time with more passion and in a higher register, and if you listen to the entry of the cellos and basses, you can hear that they're insisting on a B flat, a third higher than the previous G. I'll start this example at the point where they enter. Then there's still another similar rise of the pedal by another third to D, as timpani and cellos hold it under some more fine woodwind counterpoint. The intensity increases as the pedal rises another third to F, forcibly now. Where do we go from here? With the first movement not forgotten, the next note, a third up from F, could be A, in fact the goal of the whole symphony. But instead, we have a tremendous quiet surprise. Nielsen makes the harmony slip magically in exactly the opposite direction from what we've every right to expect, to a remote E-flat major. In fact, the remotest possible key from A. In this calm atmosphere, two human voices are heard from inside the orchestra, pointing to the remoteness of the tonality as nothing else could in an otherwise purely orchestral context. I might add that instead of expecting A at this point, we might possibly also have expected A flat, a minor third higher than the previous F. If Nielsen had done that, he could have stuck strictly to the previous scheme and made his pedal notes rise still further by thirds, arriving at E flat via C, A flat, C, E flat. But in that case, E flat would have seemed redundant after the return to C and not remote at all. The whole point would have been thrown away. Like the third movement of number 1, the allegretto of number 3 is tonally in a kind of no man's land. It's in a sort of grey, half-lit C-sharp minor. C-sharp sounds like D-flat after the E-flat ending of the slow movement. This piece is one of the most fascinatingly concentrated and closely developed movements Nielsen ever wrote, and obviously I can't tackle its intricate subtleties now. As music, it's both beautiful and exciting. There's one thing, however, we mustn't fail to hear: the splendidly glowing D major climax that rears itself out of the deep C-sharp minor before subsiding into it again. This anticipates the D major in which the broad and apparently simple finale begins. As the first movement moved from D minor to A, so the finale travels from D major to A major. As in all such cases with Nielsen, the actual end of the symphony is the only time when the key aimed at is fully established. He's as accurate and punctual in his endings as Bach, though with different principles. I said this finale was apparently simple, and so it is at first. But it's teeming with subtleties. Here's just one you might not notice till the 749th hearing. In the middle of the daringly simple main theme, you'll hear this phrase. The very different second theme suddenly borrows it. It's even slightly disturbed by it. When the big main tune comes back in A major at the end, we may not notice in the general hurly-burly that it's saying to the second theme, you pinched a bit of mine, so I'll pinch a bit of yours. That's just a small sample of how this seemingly simple movement goes on springing the kind of surprises we mustn't ever underestimate. As we've seen so far, a Nielsen symphony is constructed organically, with the growth of the tonal structure permeating all four movements from first to last, with the finale containing the clinching matter. This means that sooner or later he'd make a symphony physically continuous, and this happens in number 4. There are 4 movements, but they're joined together, and none is at all independent. Nielsen's development of tonality is sometimes called progressive tonality. I've even been accused of inventing the term, but I didn't, and I don't much care for it. In the Inextinguishable, the composer evolves the key of E out of chaos. There's an element of conflict between D minor and E major, and it becomes terrifyingly polarized towards the end. But evolution, or emergence, is the essence of the matter, and I suppose if I had to find a term for it, it would be emergent tonality. The first movement starts with a violently turbulent outbreak, D minor and C deliberately confused together, with D minor having a slight edge. The second theme, calm and orderly, is in A major, halfway between D and E, tonally speaking, the dominant of D, the subdominant of E, to put it in musician's language. During the first movement, whenever E is heard, there's trouble. There's a passage where the violas grope their way upwards by semitones, and as soon as they touch E, there's opposition. Listen to their repeated notes penetrating the disturbed texture, and how anger flares when they find E. The first movement eventually reaches E, but not securely. and the second movement, the gentle and childlike allegretto, falls into a quiet G major, eventually to be broken into by the renewed struggles of the very tense adagio. This grows to a mighty climax in E major, but without the theme we've come to associate with order and the solution to the problems. It's just the tonality. Tonality by itself isn't enough, and this leaves the finale with a massive and dramatic issue to solve. An extra set of timpani joins the fray, with the object of making the inimical key of D minor as ferocious as possible. The crunch comes when the drums hammer away at D minor, while other instruments insist on the note B, which is the dominant of E. Then the drums are literally torn away from D minor. After this, E major succeeds, and for the first time in the whole symphony, it's powerfully established. And for the first time, too, we hear the whole magnificently broad and coherent theme that's been growing and growing and growing. Even in the opening chaos of the first movement, this fragment flies by. Then this. Then something much more like it. It rouses itself. As it dies away at the end of the first movement, it manages to form the gentle melody of the second. The tense line of the adagio fights to recover its resolute nature. Near the end of the adagio, we find it becoming nobler and calmer. The finale springs out with a new and vivid transformation. No wonder it sounds so inevitable at the end. The music is evolving not only tonally but thematically as well. Nielsen's remark about this work is well known. Music is life, and like it, inextinguishable. But he put it even more simply and profoundly when he said, music is the sound of life. The fifth is the most famous and perhaps the greatest of Nielsen's symphonies. It was completed in 1922, 6 years after number 4. That symphony dealt, if you like, with the generalized conflicts of biological evolution. But there was a moment in it when we were face to face with the emergence of two dominating opposed forces. Dawning consciousness struggling against the retarding brute element. This is the starting point of the fifth. Nielsen used no title, but it's obvious all the same. Any doubts about its meaning are likely to be within the same limits as disagreements about Beethoven's Fifth, for instance. This music is all human, and the brute factor in it is that part of the human that has to be got the better of. There are two large movements. The first contains the main conflict, and the second amounts to a struggle to construct something from the ashes, not without difficulties. The work is an internal human drama, psychologically very observant. But it seems also to animate in terms of music those same problems as they're manifest in the open social contentions of the world at large. So it's a work of severe and gripping aptness to the situation in which we all find ourselves, as individuals and as members of human society. Nielsen's solutions are neither easy nor concretely explicit. What he finally urges is courage and guts, no romanticism, but constructive, hopeful endeavour against whatever odds crop up. It's a spirit that's expressed, one without which nobody can hope to cope. So far as its tonal construction is concerned, it's the most original and powerful of his conceptions. In the third symphony, we noticed how the slow movement was built on successive tonal plateaux, each a third higher than the other. In the first movement of number 5, he returns to something like this idea and has 3 vast terraces or planes, rising this time by fifths, F, C, and G, the opening wavy line on the violas. That's like the passing of time, against which events form themselves. Shapes appear behind and through it. Sometimes it reacts to them, as a seismograph will record distant earth tremors. Then it settles to its neutral uniformity. A long line forms in the violins, and under it, the bass reveals that the tonality is F. From time to time, the seismograph seems to warn of trouble. Nielsen said he felt this opening as expressing a kind of indifference. Vegetating, he said. And we're made to associate this F tonality with a sort of inertia, something to be got out of. The first real disturbance comes with the entry of the side drum, beating out a mindlessly simple rhythm. The wavy viola line becomes a horrid tramping, and the woodwind begin to sound wild. But the thoughts compose themselves a little, and the bass firmly grasps the note C. We've reached the second big tonal plane. Soon the bass tries to struggle upwards, trying to get to G. Now D flat. D natural, E flat, F, G flat. It gets as far as G flat, but no further, and falls again to C. Against all this, you can hear a strange, high, repeated note. It sounds even weirder against the background of A-flat harmonies. That note is D, and it's the remotest possible note from the background A-flat. Halfway between the two lies F, so there's a real danger of drifting back to the old inertia. But D is the dominant of G, and that queer flashing light in the dark is the means to guide the music into G major. So there's the third great plateau, G major, and it's a world full of light. Superb arches of luminous counterpoint fill the clear air. But when we think all's well, we hear the seismograph warning again. Then the attack comes, culminating in the famous passage in which Nielsen directs the side drummer to go berserk, to improvise as if at all costs to destroy the music. But the majestic counterpoint persists, and in one of the greatest climaxes in 20th century music, the side drum is finally swallowed up. At the end, the atmosphere is like that of a deserted battlefield, with the clarinet sounding a kind of poignant last post, and the memory of the side drum vanishing into nothing. Some critics have said that this drum improvisation is a forerunner of the present-day aleatoric school, in which happenings are governed by chance. But the whole point of it, surely, is that Nielsen's glorious counterpoint can withstand even an attack like that. The second movement is regenerative. It starts in B major, a third above the G major of the previous movement, and the furthest possible key from the first of all the keys, F, which is associated with inertia. But for various reasons I can't demonstrate now, they can be found in my book on Nielsen, B is unstable. And after some heroic music there comes a sinister passage with soft, flashing Ds alternating with A flats. It reminds us of something bad. Think of this in the first movement. D against A flat. Now here's the same thing in the second movement. Now it's worse. The two elements are equal, and there's no choice but to slide down a slippery slope into the inertia key of F, halfway between D and A flat. Now a fluttery and panicky fugue takes over. It reaches a terrible pitch of panic and finally collapses. Panic is no answer. We must think. So another fugue begins. Slow this time, thoughtful. Slowly, purpose and warm blood flow into it, and in one of Nielsen's finest passages, both as polyphony and inspired music, it grows towards a climax, at which the opening of the movement is restored in its original allegro tempo. Compare the slow fugue subject with the main theme of the movement. The same. But we're back in B major, a key not stable in the circumstances of this symphony. But nothing can stop the music now, and it storms its way forward, ultimately finding the key of E flat, which for various deep reasons I can't tackle now, is the only possible one. This work ends not with triumph, but with incandescent determination. Nielsen is a realist. The last of Nielsen's symphonies was finished in 1925. He'd been very ill with the heart trouble that eventually finished his life 6 years later, though outwardly he seemed to most people to be in his normal good spirits. He said that in his new symphony he wanted to write with the same simple enjoyment of the pure sound as the old vocal composers. It was to be completely idyllic. He was aiming at a new transparency, like chamber music. After the symphony was complete, he said he'd sought to individualize the instruments. Characteristically, he said, "I think through the instruments themselves, almost as if I'd crept inside them." Also, he said, "I've tried to make the symphony as lively and gay as possible." He completely achieved the new transparency and a wonderful instrumental characterization. But the gaiety, well, something very different, I think. He wanted to call the work Sinfonia semplice, simple symphony. He wrote nothing less simple in his life, and it's perhaps significant that the title doesn't appear on the first printed score. So he might have wanted to drop it, which is why we've not used it on this record. When 22 years ago I wrote the chapter on number 6 in my book, I'd not had a chance to hear the work, let alone the chance to live with it. At that time, I was disappointed that his courageous and life-giving philosophy seemed to have taken a severe blow. I still think this is so, but the disappointment has given way to a realization that the courage is still there, expressed with a greater consistency than I'd perceived. I'm still not sure that the work is so totally organic as the others, but the longer I know it, the more I find in it, and that gives me hope that I shall discover a lot more secrets yet. On one question, my mind is still exactly the same. The first movement is one of the greatest pieces of tragic music composed by anyone. It begins with childlike gaiety in a pastoral G major. The tragedy lies in a fruitless search to recapture this happiness after it's been fearfully shattered. And as usual with Nielsen, the form and the content are one. The tonal structure of this marvelous movement is inextricably bound up with what the piece expresses. There are only 3 keys that establish themselves in it. At the beginning is G major. The other 2 are F sharp and A flat, each a semitone away from the first key. That's not far in terms of mere pitch, but tonally it's a long way. I don't suppose Nielsen knew much of Tennyson's poetry, though he was a wide reader, but that famous line from In Memoriam comes to mind, so near and yet so far. In the middle of the movement, savage snarls are suddenly, incredibly suddenly, dispelled by some wonderfully serene music which we could be forgiven for thinking was in G major. But it's F sharp major, therefore it's not real, and the vision fades. Near the end of the movement, after far worse terrors, there's no longer any hope, but the gentle opening G major phrase is sadly recalled in A flat minor, and the movement ends there. Let me put these 3 passages close to each other so that you can hear clearly the differences between them. First, the delightfully fresh opening in G major. Now the grand and serene music from the heart of the movement in F sharp major, a semitone lower. And the sad A flat minor near the end. Between these three crucial points, the music is the most terrible and fantastic Nielsen had ever composed, delivered with often frightening clarity. The transparency is there all right, but scarcely the kind he originally had in mind. At one point, there's an appalling crisis, in which a distraught climax is abruptly cut off to leave a screaming semitonal dissonance, like a frightful pain, followed by hideous palpitations, which I can't listen to without wondering if such music is not the direct consequence of a heart attack. Nielsen tried to make this symphony lively and gay, and if he failed, it resulted in some of his greatest music. What about the rest? I don't now believe, as I did all those years ago, that it represents a descent from objectivity to the subjective. Intense and tragic though the first movement is, it is an objective delineation of tragedy, in the old Greek sense. There's no self-pity in it, even if the tragedy is personal. Nielsen doesn't say, "See how miserable I am." He says, "This is what suffering and tragedy mean." This particular tragedy is certainly personal in origin, but I now see the humoresque that follows it as an attempt to brush off the tragedy with a grim joke, rather than the merely vituperative piece I once thought it. It does pillory the trivialities of the so-called avant-garde of the 20s, but it's tough and disciplined. The more you listen to it, the harder and clearer are its edges. The Proposta Seria begins like a great slow movement in E minor, and we wonder if Nielsen's going to lift the work onto another plane altogether. A movement pursued on the lines of its opening could have been on a vast scale. But that kind of expansive eloquence can hardly flourish in the presence of the kind of humour we've just experienced. So it's fully consistent that this piece should become immobile, entangled. Yet even in its tortuous coils, it's subtle, intense, and poetic. In the end, beautiful. And its brevity doesn't impair its power to suggest things far beyond its own bounds. If you listen to it carefully, you'll find that it makes a point of hinting at the keys of F sharp, A flat, and G, as if remembering, though hardly daring to think about, the first movement. Its ending in A flat is surely one of the most wonderful sounds in this consummately scored symphony. That harmony contains a soft contradiction between harmonies of A flat major and B flat minor, and we must escape from A flat, where the first movement finally abandoned its search, even if humour is again the only way out. So B flat major it is for the variations of the finale. The humour is brilliant and barbed, sometimes downright brutal, as when a delicious comical waltz is deliberately smashed to bits by vandalistic brass. In the variation that follows, number 8, Nielsen briefly condenses the whole of the tragedy in music so concentrated and sharply felt, yet so objectively consistent with the rest, that one's forced to concede that the humour, too, is as concentrated as that. The last variation is a grinning skeleton in the style of the humoresque, and it goes straight into a fiercely defiant, brilliant, steely, sardonic coda, ending with a precisely placed raspberry. I was wrong in my priggish youth to say that it was too late for such things to be comic. Henry Fielding wouldn't have agreed with me, certainly not after describing the end on the gallows of his hero Jonathan Wild, who applied his hands to the parson's pocket and emptied it of the bottle screw, which he carried out of the world in his hand.